It's a great pleasure to welcome back to CYA, back indeed, Thomas Scanlon, Emeritus Professor at the University of California at Riverside, who was with us in, what was it, 2019? Was it? Oh my goodness. No, 18, 19? Oh goodness. For the Thucydides, we were, Marinadis and I organized a conference on our beloved Thucydides. And Thomas was here for that. Welcome back. Certainly known to people of interest in sports and athletics. He's published widely on Greek and Latin Roman historiography of sports and sexuality, athletics and politics, sport and spectacle. And following on from much of Angelos's talk, we will now hear of masculinity and the popularity of violent sport in ancient Greece. Tom.
No, thanks very much, Robert. In fact, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the college here in Athens for all of the hard work behind the scenes to put this together, finally, to be here, and to the staff especially. And in memory of Hal Evgen, who I unfortunately never met, but I admire certainly his work. I share his passion in teaching and study of ancient athletics, Greek sports especially. And I know that when I began doing this in the early 1980s, it was not something a classics person was supposed to do. It was on the fringe. You did not get promotions for working in ancient sports. Now I'm glad to say there's been a sort of watershed moment, and there are books and articles coming out, and I'm just delighted to see lots of young people jumping in and working on this area. I'm also excited to be next to the Panathenaic Stadium here, which of course was the site for Panathenaic Games 2,000 plus years ago, and to think of the events that were going on back then, you know, the pentathlon, the racing, the boxing sports, and so on. It's exciting to think of that, as well as the first modern Olympics, the 2004 Olympics, all sorts of exciting things that went on there. There was probably a scama there, and this title of this conference is Beyond the Scama, which I'm sort of taking metaphorically. The scama, as you probably know, it's either a jumping pit for the long jump, and legendarily, a couple of different athletes, Phyolus of Croton and Kionis of Sparta, leapt farther than the 50-foot length of this scama, probably in multiple jumps. And one legend is that Phyolus broke his leg doing that. But we're not breaking legs. We're trying to break barriers of thought here and add new information to our knowledge of events. And the scama is also the dugout area for wrestling and boxing and pankration. So that kind of leads into my area today of what was going on in the violent sports and the combat sports, which is this is partly an introductory thing to a bigger project that I'm working on gender violence and Greek, Roman, and modern sports. Okay, so this works like this. And globally, in a 2023 survey, males 18 to 44 constituted 51 to 53% of fans of combat sports on television, while females numbered only 24%. So basically, males were 76% of the audience last year. The Ultimate Fighting Championships, I don't know if you can read this very well, there were more than 900 million households weekly on television across 170 plus countries watching these ultimate fighting, which is like pankration. And then the World Wrestling Entertainment, which is a special, very profitable enterprise, stages more than 200 live events annually, with events watched by over 1 billion people on a weekly basis in more than 180 countries. Stunning numbers. Combat sports, of course, were also the most popular events in ancient Greek festivals, as I hope to prove today. It's not surprising that the attraction to violence is mainly a male preoccupation. Whether this is cultural or a biological phenomenon, or most likely a combination of both, is something beyond our purview today. My focus here is not the violence of the sports themselves, but the broad public attraction to violent events and how that popularity may endorse male violence more generally in society beyond the stadium. Gareth Fagan, the late Gareth Fagan, commented regarding gladiator games, part of what is going on watching sports live as a member of a crowd is what Durkheim dubbed collective effervescence, that sense of empowerment, connectedness, validation, and even euphoria that people feel when sharing a mass event with like-minded fellow enthusiasts, end quote. Yet can this infection of spectators with violent enthusiasm be manifest not only in fan riots, etc., but also by encouraging men to dominate others outside the stadium? In US law code, physical violence is defined as an assault or other infliction or threat of infliction of death or bodily harm on an individual. Of course, violence can also be psychological. But within the context of legitimate sporting contests, violence is consensual among participants, and it's controlled and normally acceptable when it is not life-threatening or causing long-term physical harm. In men's contests, the dominance or hegemony of a victorious competitor is immediately asserted over the loser. In daily life, when men assert domination over women or other males by physical or psychological violence, the motivation for this violence can arise from multiple social and cultural factors. The heroization of combat athletes is certainly one factor contributing to and validating social violence, especially gendered violence, to assert masculinity or prove who is more masculine by bullying, threats, and abusive actions. Men's violence, sport, and spectacle is evidenced in many cultures globally over history, but the Greek, Roman, and I'd argue modern phenomena are remarkable for their longevity, their institutionalization, and their wide popularity. The most violent and popular Greek contests were the combat sports, or the heavy events, so named for the bulky size of the competitors in boxing, wrestling, and pankration. The last of these is effectively a mixture of boxing, wrestling, and something like martial arts. Inscriptions attest that combat sports were regularly the last events at the program at a Greek festival, a position serving as the dramatic climax of the one attracting the greatest interest. The heavy events were the final ones in every Olympic program from their inception in 708 BCE into the Roman era, except when the hoplite race was introduced at the end of the program in the late 6th century to signal the end of the Olympic truce. Wrestling, boxing, and pankration also come final in a list from the Panathenaic Games of 202 to 201 BCE. And the same pattern recurs in other lists of victors elsewhere. The most exciting games, in other words, come last. That's a basic theatrical setup. A few inscriptions, we're moving to prizes here. A few inscriptions highlight the top value prizes for combat sport victors. In 550 BCE, an Olympic victor from southern Italy, Cleombrotus, probably in the combat events, dedicated a statue of himself to Athena, paid for from a tenth of the prize money from his hometown. Then again, in a famous Panathenaic prize list from 400 to 350 BCE, the three combat sports are the final ones in the boys, youths, and men's categories. The prizes, men's pentathlon, wrestling, and boxing, for example, get 60 amphoras of olive oil each, while pankration gets 80. And only the traditional stage race wins more, 100 amphoras. In the Asia Minor city of Aphrodisias, an inscription from the late 2nd century CE lists prizes for contests in a local festival. Adult prizes are 2,000 denarii each for wrestling and boxing victors, 3,000 for the Pancratias, while the adult state race gets a measly 1,250 denarii. H.W. Pluckett has commented on this. Compared with what we know about workers' wages, these victory prizes are considerable sums, end quote. In short, the greater value of the prizes for combat sports likely indicates that they are the more highly popular and esteemed. Honorary inscriptions and statues for heavy victors bear out this picture. Regarding the proliferation in Asia Minor, our friend here in the audience, Otto van Niep, summarizes, there is no indication that the heavy numbers become less popular. Hundreds, thousands of inscriptions in honor of heavy athletes throughout the Roman East are testimony to their continuing popularity, at least until the 4th century. Then turning to the Peloponnese, athletic statues at Messini in the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE were actually placed mostly in the Agora, linking, quote, service and character within the polis. 11 of the 15 inscriptions in the Agora are Pancration and in one of the other combat sports. At Olympia, Pausanias selectively names 197 victor statues. 111 of these, 56%, are combat sport victors who comprise the bulk of his descriptions, while in actual practice, heavy events comprise only 27% of the 22 total events held at any Olympic festival. Pausanias may have had a certain preference for combat sport athletes because of the drama of their stories or the quality of their monuments. He sort of indicates this. But he must have also considered especially the appetite of his public or his readers for the violent games. The major athletic synod in Rome, Curia Athletarum, was founded in 143 BCE by Oppius Domesticus, who himself was an Olympic victor in combat sports. This was the big corporate sports organization in the Roman era. The Curia featured a large central statue of a Pancratius, Philumenos, set up in the 4th century CE. And Pancratius were favored as royal appointees to be the local Zistarchs in charge of supervising games in the circuit. There are 12 of these circuit Zistarchs in combat sports listed by Clarence Forbes, and also 2 wrestlers appointed to Zistarch status. A mosaic, which is in a tavern in Ostia, shows a pair of leading Pancratius, Aurelius Alexander and Aurelius Helix, at a famous match of the Capitoline Games in 218 CE. Helix was the victor, but Alexander later held the position of the chief priest of the athletic synod, Curia, in Rome. The mosaic suggests widespread interest in Greek boxing in Rome. Combat athletes were often not ignorant, bulky brutes, as you might assume, but rose to the top in civic honors. Ruachet records a series of inscriptions for 7 boy victors in combat sports at Aphrodisias, which demonstrates an enthusiasm for combat sports that involve Greek boys or youths, whose parents from, quote, leading families endorsed their participation, despite the risks and on account of the public display of the masculine virtues of these young boys. The most striking and beautifully moving extant statue of a combat athlete is that of the so-called Terme boxer, a life-size bronze from the 3rd to 2nd century BCE, now in Rome. It was actually found in the Baths of Constantine and depicts an athlete between or after rounds, clearly exhausted and bearing the traces of many scars and even trickles of blood that were put into the bronze. It displays dignity, strength, and violent potential, and was clearly favored by the ancient public as having quasi-magical powers, which is evidenced by the fact that there were traces of reverent rubbing of his left-hand glove and of his outstretched right foot, the way they do for saints in the Vatican. Combat athletes generally enable and embodied the attributes of masculinity, strength, and courage, and daring, and thereby conveyed honor and prestige to their home city. An Olympic inscription of the late 1st century CE extols the Pancratius Tiberius Claudius Rufus of Smyrna, who, quote, stood out among the Pancratius of his own day on account of his Andrea and Sophrosune, temperance. Van Neef observes that Andrea appears regularly on the epigraphic texts of athletes, especially combat ones, who advance to be among the elite for their manly virtue. An elaborate inscription at Aphrodisias honors the 3rd century CE Pancratius Aurelius Achilles, who competed, quote, with total Andrea as an ephebe. And then, at the encouragement of his fans in the city, he went on to win in the men's contests, so that, quote, his display of Andrea and eagerness, prothumia, are to be numbered among the most distinguished of contests, end quote. Another honorific inscription from Aphrodisias presents a local athlete, Callicrates, who displays an ideal combination of brawn and brain. His noble reputation among all the people, it says, noble reputation among all people to the ends of the inhabited world on the basis of both his masculinity, which there is andreotetos, and his complete wisdom, Sophia, which he obtained by his labors. Now, Andrea itself, or andreotes, is of course courage and is not a simple equivalent to masculinity, but evolves from an early martial masculinity to an athletic one, and then later to the political Andrea of Plato and Aristotle. Plato defines Andrea as endurance of the soul. Aristotle says it's an interesting definition, the observance of the mean in respect of fear and confidence, not going too far, being too afraid or too risky. The Cambridge Greek Lexicon and the LSJ gloss Andrea as manliness, manly spirit, or courage. The sense of masculine courage, daring, and aggression are therefore present throughout the history of this term in all of its, I would argue, in all of its appearances. Visually, on a 2nd century CE theater relief at Hierapolis, Asia Minor, Andrea, with a capital A, is represented as a female figure resembling the Greek Athena, or an Amazon, or possibly Roman Virtus, or maybe all three, positioned alongside other contest-related images in the same relief. Synodos, Agonothesia, and Tuke, the athletic synod, the presidency of the games, and luck. Base paintings and mosaics demonstrate the broad popularity of combat sports. In the period of 550 to 450, the high point for the depiction of sports on vases, a search of the Beasley archives finds that the pentathlon events number the most, 837, because they're kind of cool to depict the discus and everything, but they involve wrestling. While the heavy events exclusively add up to 678 depictions, equestrians total 484, and foot races only 193, not so spectacular. Before 570 BC, I found only 12 images of boxers, which were at that point a close second in depictions to the foot races. So there was a shift there for some reason. A 550 to, here we have on the screen, a 550 to 540 BCE amphora by Nicosthenes in the British Museum, showing two heavy boxers mid-match shedding blood in a display of violence, pretty well-known depiction. But on the bottom, we have a mosaic from the 2nd century to the 3rd century CE, Patras, which depicts an entire festival with over 30 figures, including 4 pairs of boxers near the end. This used to be at the Olympic Athletes Museum in Olympia, but it's now in Patras in the beautiful new museum there. The losers are laid flat or cowering, which highlights interest in viewing violent domination, I would argue. And a 239 CE mosaic in the Museum of Gafsa, Tunisia, which I've the privilege of seeing once, also shows a complete athletic festival, including bloody scenes from the climaxes of boxing and pancration, which you can see there on the right. Spectators in later Roman periods seem to expect even greater degrees of violence in their combat sports, according to Sophie Remigson. Pancration was sometimes replaced in Antioch by an even more brutal version of the sport called pamakon, sort of all strength as well, which was more popular and less technical. Now, there was a greater display for demands of violence, I think, in this later Roman period. It was possibly, I think, encouraged by the proliferation of gladiatorial spectacles in the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's not to say that the Romans pushed this on the Eastern Mediterranean. The recent things look like the Eastern Mediterranean Greek people welcomed the display of gladiators in their arenas. This is sort of just talked about by scholars. But in these later there were professional combat athletes who performed in the circus spectacles. They weren't really agones, they were circus spectacles. And the circus athletes embodied the new dehumanized displays, starkly illustrated by the very late 6th century CE Italian vase, so-called Kovacs vase, in which the victor taunts the loser in Latin, qui sibi fecit non ploret. He who did it to himself shouldn't cry. Stop crying. You lost. And he calls him kinaiden, which is sodomite or something horrible like that. And he even in one of the depictions on this strip at the bottom seems to be sodomizing the loser. So this extreme indulgence in defeat, as Remigson calls it, may be an aspect of late antique contests of hired athletes. I think it's gone a bit far in this sort of fantasy of that Kovacs vase, but anyway. In early Greek literary accounts also reflect the popular fascination with violent sports from Homer onwards. Of course, you all know in Iliad 23, the Patroclus Games, the boxing scene is prominent for its length of about 50 lines and for its position right after the chariot race. The lowly carpenter Epeius boasts, "I am the greatest. I'll tear any opponent of mine limb from limb and smash his bones together." And then he confronts his noble opponent, Euryalus. They fell in on each other, and there was a gnashing of teeth and sweat poured from their limbs. Then Epeius rushed in and hit him on the jaw, and his knees buckled. Moving to the Odyssey, Odyssey 18, Odysseus boxes with the beggar Eros in an impromptu match marked by a gory outcome, which the viewing suitors find hilarious. On the right shoulder, Eros hit Odysseus, but the other struck his neck under the ear and crushed the bone inside. At once, gory blood came out of his mouth. He fell bellowing in the dust. Then the noble suitors held their hands up and died with laughter. There's obviously an irony there. And Odysseus took him by the foot and dragged him through the door until he reached the courtyard and the doors of the porch. Really gory stuff, which is outside of the normal gory stuff on the battlefield. Later epigrams and anecdotes tell of combat athletes who use brutal techniques to maim or attack with occasional but rarely fatal results. Noteworthy, I think, is the wrestler Leontiscus of Messene, known as the finger breaker. He was Olympic victor in 456 and 452 BCE, but he seems to be here breaking fingers to win his matches, violating a 6th century BC rule against the practice, which we have, so who knows how that worked. Elsewhere, in a simple papyrus fragment of a satyr play, likely by Sophocles, The chorus of satyrs lists the qualifications for entering an agon to win the king's daughter to get a bride. Required skills, techni, include those of contests of wrestling, equestrian events, foot races, boxing, and the twisting of teeth and testicles, end quote. The last, of course, alludes to pancration. Yes, this is a fictional parody, but the humor expects the audience to recognize the violence in pancration and to find it funny. The comedy relies particularly on how pancration directly threatens vulnerable male genitalia. In short, the sport is a measure of masculine strength or weakness. I can't add a whole lot more, but there's a number of, as you probably know, superhero athletes such as Theogenes of Thasos, who were literally heroized, given statues and shrines, and thought to have great magical powers. In sum, the proliferation of inscriptions, high prize values, connections with manliness, numerous visual images, and literary accounts all attest to the wide popularity of Greek combat sports among the ancient male audience. The interest in and intensity of violence seems to have increased in the Roman imperial era, both in the Western and Eastern Mediterranean. Evidence indicates that the combat sports were an index of andreia, or masculinity, in the heroization of aggression, strength, and daring. Violence inside the ancient stadium is controlled and consensual, normally avoiding serious or fatal harm. And as the friend Spartan poet Tyrtaeus notes, that this is not the same as being a warrior. Athletic skills do not make a man an aner agathos in battle, a good man in battle. The heroization of combat athletes, however, can be carried over to values outside the stadium. Male spectators see an image to emulate. Athletic andreia and ordinary masculinity overlap with the masculinity of the victorious soldier. Victory is a badge of what a man should be. A man does not have status by his gender alone, but has to earn and define it by successful actions. Masculinity is a key element of violent sports, not only in Greece, but in other cultures and today. The hegemonic male seeks in his daily life to be the leader, the one on top, dominating other men and women, sometimes by physical threats and more often by verbal bullying and body language. Although Roman gladiatorial spectacle and contemporary violent sports today occupy quite different socio-cultural contexts from the Greek sports, they are comparable to Greek combat sports in terms of popularity, regular public performance, and longevity. Violent forms of other cultures and eras, violent contests of other cultures and eras, which do exist, I would argue, do not match the diffusion popularity among the Greeks, Romans, and today. Part of this is public media. The French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme, Ave Caesar morituri te salutant, that famous painting that inspired the Gladiator movie, highlights the crucial role of the imperial spectators approving of the fatal spectacle. The American painter Thomas Eakins alludes to Gérôme and his painting called Salutat, he salutes, an image of a victorious boxer cheered by intent all male spectators in the background. It's hard to see on the right there. Boxing is thus compared to the Roman contest, but placed on a more democratic American level. And the pale, it's hard to see the pale boxer is almost like a Greek statue, very pale and sort of statuesque, which I think is intentional. Finally, the American artist, George Bellows, which many of you haven't heard about, he's from Columbus, Ohio originally, and ended up living in New York, portrayed the physical energy of boxing and involvement of spectators in a 1909 painting called Stag at Starkey's. Starkey's was a club where they had boxing, and Stag was the men's night. Bellows commented, "I'm not interested in the morality of prize fighting, but let me say that the atmosphere around the fighters is a lot more immoral than the fighters themselves," end quote. And again, it's hard to see, but these two men who are fighting look almost just like meat. And there are men in the background who are sort of smiling and grimming and cheering them on with these sort of, as he says, sort of immoral reactions. For Bellows, the boxers are portrayed as raw meat before a savage crowd hungry for violence, reflecting the negative effect on wider societal values. Now, professional boxing was not legal in the US in the days of Eakins and Bellows, and existed only in the realms of amateur contests and private clubs. Despite the moral critique of Bellows and others, legalization did come in 1921 in the US with the founding of the National Boxing Association. Then the sport really took off in the 1950s and 60s with televised broadcasts. I'll end by noting that cultural values have shifted greatly since Greek antiquity, but the close association of masculinity and popular spectacles of violence have kept alive a heroic image that influences wider society even today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, well, we are no strangers at see why the violent combat.
Okay.
Your view that violent sports are popular throughout antiquity, but I was wondering about a central tension that there's also visible in the sources. One of the tensions is, of course, that the whole gymnastic is about self-control. You mentioned a number of stories about athletes, heavy athletes, Theagenes and others. And the point of most of the stories about those people is that they actually self-control, called Theagenes and others heroized, but they were not heroized because they were admired, more or less, who were fearing their violent behavior. The case of Theagenes, it was, of course, his statue who had done the wrong thing, but in other cases, Polydamas of Scotus, others, it's so is there, in the way that athletes are considered, also a kind of tension between what they are representing and what sport perhaps should represent to other people?
No, it's a good question. I think there is a tension there, and certainly all of the honoring of these young men as good citizens is also showing that there's a tension, and that, as I said, it's the violence within sports is consensual and controlled. And so it's not like the kind of violence that one sees, generally beating each other to death or something. But my point is that there's a kind of leakage of a sort of insinuations of violent actions that your average audience looks at, and they're not as controlled as some of the athletes, some who are praised for their control in avoiding blows. But that's the exception. But people like to see the blows, they like to see the blood, and I think they'd like to see, especially in boxing, I should say, and somewhat in pancration, is where the blood and the gore come out. And they'd like to see that kind of violence. But the question is how it might transfer to an audience and how they might interpret it. It's almost impossible to say this definitely affected how they behaved at home to their wives. But, except on Super Bowl Sunday, there are a lot of abuses in the home, people drinking and watching sports. But I think it's just this general value of placing on a pedestal, especially the athletes who are doing the most violent sports. I mean, you don't put on the pedestal the foot racers or the discus throwers so much. I don't know. Do you have any other? I mean, maybe.
No, the only one thing is that the people who are in the audience would have gone through the gymnasium themselves and being taught about the importance of physical self-control, even in strength. So this tension is sort of circulating between players and audiences.
That's true.
They must have also loved the violence. You're right.
I mean, Aphrodisias, there is a section for the certain fans, of certain youth fans. And Ruachet postulates it might be to control their getting out of hand while they're fans of this violence. So yes, they know how to control themselves as sporting people, but they can get out of hand.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Just one quick question that you might expect. You mentioned at some point that an author mentioned that being a good athlete in these violent sports does not make the athlete a good warrior. You talk about agathos στη μάχη, if I recall. Is this a passage in reference to the skills of the warrior or the ethos of the warrior, if it is possible to distinguish?
I think probably a little of both, but more the skills, I think, because there's later criticisms of the athletic skills not being preparations for warfare, generally speaking. I know this changes in the Hellenistic period, but the original sort of skills that Tyrtaeus was talking about were sort of not what you need. And I think what you really need most as a warrior is the warrior's spirit, psyche. You know, you need this enthusiasm to go into battle and risk your life, which is not really what an athlete does usually.
True. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.